Why are you taking his blood? I do not allow this. Caroline Hayes's voice tore through the blood donation room at Street. Mary's hospital, sharp enough to slice through the frantic energy already hanging thick in the air. Every nurse froze mid-step. Someone dropped a tray of gauze. A monitor let out a long, irritated beep, as if offended by the disruption. All eyes shifted toward the woman standing in the doorway, breathless, pale, and trembling, with a kind of fury only terror could fuel. Caroline's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she stormed forward, her designer coat sliding off one shoulder, her hair undone from running across the hospital. Moments ago, she had been summoned because her 8-year-old daughter, Grace, had suffered a sudden internal hemorrhage. Now she was staring at the man lying on the donation bed, hooked to a tube of rare O-negative blood flowing into a bag, her daughter's last hope. But instead of gratitude, panic twisted her into something raw and unfiltered. "Stop this," she barked, pointing at him. "You cannot use his blood for my child." The nurses exchanged looks, slow, exhausted, unimpressed. One muttered just loud enough, "Her kid's dying and she's still acting like she owns the place." Another added, "Money won't buy rare blood today." A third shook her head. "God, I hate that rich lady attitude." The whispers cut through the sterile room, a chorus of resentment usually kept quiet, now emboldened by the urgency of life and death. Caroline stiffened. For a moment her fury flickered into confusion, then into humiliation as she sensed the contempt around her. She opened her mouth, ready to lash out, but then her gaze fully locked onto the man on the bed. Recognition hit her with brutal force. Elijah Brooks, the janitor, the man whose cart she had barked at just hours earlier, the man she had belittled, dismissed, treated as an inconvenience unworthy of eye contact. Her mind snapped backward into the memory of that morning like a door slamming shut. Earlier that day, the executive lobby of Hayes Global had gleamed under the morning lights, the marble polished to a shine Elijah himself had worked on. He was pushing his cleaning cart carefully, keeping to the side, making sure not to disturb anyone. But as the executive elevator opened, Caroline stepped out with 2 department heads, espresso in one hand, irritation already etched across her face. Her eyes shot straight to the cart, blocking her path. "Hey you," she snapped, "move that cart out of the way. Now." Elijah immediately pulled it back, murmuring, "Sorry, ma'am." But she wasn't finished. "No wonder productivity is down," she said loudly enough for her team to hear. "Some people can't even do the simplest tasks." The directors looked at Elijah with awkward sympathy before averting their eyes. Elijah lowered his head, swallowing whatever pride he had left. He didn't argue, he never did. And now the same man she humiliated was giving blood, his rare blood, for her dying daughter. Back in the hospital, Caroline's breathing quickened. The room seemed to shrink around her as she stared at Elijah's face calm, despite the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. His work boots were still dusty, his calloused hands lay open at his sides. He looked nothing like the type of man she believed could ever matter in her world. Yet here he was, holding the line between her daughter and death. A doctor stepped forward. "Miss Hayes," he said firmly, "your daughter would not have survived the first intervention without this donor." Caroline swallowed. He's the only match? The only one available in time. And he volunteered. Those last words shattered something inside her. She blinked back tears she refused to shed. Volunteered. For a child he didn't know. For the daughter of a woman who had treated him like he wasn't even human. Caroline looked at him again, this time truly seeing him. The quiet strength in his posture, the dignity in his stillness, the weariness that came from long days and longer nights. She felt suddenly, profoundly ashamed. Elijah stirred, his eyes opening slightly. He glanced at Caroline, not with resentment, but with a calmness that made her feel even smaller. "Your daughter's strong," he murmured. "She's fighting. That's all that matters right now." The words were simple, spoken with no expectation, no bitterness. Caroline almost flinched. The nurses resumed their work, but their earlier whispers hung in the air, an invisible verdict. They all knew who had dignity today and who didn't. Caroline's legs weakened. She reached instinctively for the edge of Elijah's bed to steady herself. Her voice cracked. "Elijah, She couldn't finish the sentence, because what could she say? "I treated you like nothing, and you saved my daughter anyway." Elijah's eyelids drifted closed again. The monitor beeped steadily beside him. But the world inside the room had shifted. Something had cracked open, something raw and humbling. As Caroline stared at the man she had dismissed just hours earlier, she felt the weight of her own arrogance settling around her shoulders. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerful. She felt human, and as the fluorescent light flickered overhead, no longer harsh but strangely gentle, she realized she was standing at the beginning of something irreversible, a reckoning born not from rage, but from grace, the grace of a man she had never bothered to respect. Elijah lay still, unaware of the storm he had unleashed in the heart of a woman who ruled skyscrapers but had forgotten what true dignity looked like. And in that moment, the room itself seemed to understand. Something sacred had begun. If this moment moved you, if Elijah's quiet courage and dignity touched something in your heart, please like this episode and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Caroline's place? The executive lobby of Hayes Global glimmered beneath the glow of recessed lighting, the kind that made the marble floors seem like sheets of ice and every footstep feel too loud. It was barely 8 a.m., but the place was already breathing with its usual rhythm. The clipped taps of designer heels, the soft hum of espresso machines, the murmured updates about deadlines and quarterly projections. It was the kind of world that never slowed down long enough to acknowledge the people who cleaned up after it. Elijah Brooks pushed his cleaning cart through the far end of the lobby, careful not to let its wheels squeak against the polished stone. He wore his usual gray uniform, faded at the elbows, with his name stitched in white thread over the chest. He moved quietly, as if the air around executives required a gentler touch. Years ago, he would have walked the halls of companies like this wearing a suit, tablet in hand, talking about structural tolerances and engineering efficiency. That felt like another lifetime. Now he wiped fingerprints off glass and made sure trash cans never overflowed. He didn't complain. Work was work. Dignity was dignity. But some mornings tested him more than others. He parked his cart near the elevator bank, kneeling to scrub a scuff mark off the floor. He was so focused on the stain that he didn't notice the elevator ding, didn't notice the soft gasp of a director stepping aside, didn't notice the storm approaching until it was already on top of him. "Hey you," a sharp voice snapped. "Move that cart out of the way, now." Elijah looked up into the eyes of Caroline Hayes, CEO, powerhouse, untouchable. Her expression was a portrait of irritation. Behind her stood two department heads, both holding tablets, both suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. Elijah rose slowly. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, pulling the cart back. But Caroline wasn't finished. She flicked a hand toward him as though brushing away dust. "This is why the building runs behind schedule. People not doing their jobs." She said it loudly, deliberately, so that everyone in earshot could hear. Elijah felt the sting, sharp and humiliating, but he swallowed it. Pride didn't keep the lights on. He nodded once, resumed wiping the floor. The elevator doors closed behind her, sealing away her judgment like a vault. For a long moment, Elijah stayed crouched there, staring at the faint mark on the marble. He let out a slow breath. "Same old," he muttered to himself. But that wasn't entirely true. Something in him had tightened, a frustration he didn't have the luxury to express. After finishing the lobby, he clocked out for a break, stepping outside into the brisk Chicago wind. The city bustled with morning life buses groaning down Michigan Avenue, cyclists weaving through traffic, early risers clutching coffee cups as if for survival. Elijah pulled his jacket tighter and started walking toward St. Mary's Hospital. Saturdays were his volunteer days, something he looked forward to with a quiet affection he rarely admitted aloud. Street, Mary's wasn't glamorous. Paint peeled in places, the cafeteria smelled faintly of overcooked vegetables, and the elevators took their time like elderly men with stories to tell. But the place had warmth, real warmth, the kind built from patience and kindness, not quarterly profits. When Elijah arrived, the volunteer coordinator waved him in. "Morning, Elijah. You're at the children's wing today," he smiled. "My favorite assignment." The children's wing buzzed with soft chatter and bright murals. Nurses bustled between rooms. Some kids dozed, others played with hand-me-down toys. Elijah moved through them gently, picking up crayons, refilling water cups, reading books with animated voices that made even the shyest children smile. He had a gift, one the world didn't pay him for, but one the children repaid with trust. Miss Coleman, the older nurse with silver curls and sharp eyes, approached him with a clipboard. "You hear about the trauma case that just came in?" Elijah shook his head. She lowered her voice. 8-year-old girl. Internal bleeding. It's bad." He frowned. "Is she going to be okay?" "Won't know until they stabilize her," Miss Coleman said. "They're calling for O-negative donors. Rare type." Elijah froze. "O-negative?" She gave him a long look, the kind that held more knowing than words ever could. "That's you, isn't it?" Elijah swallowed. "Yeah." She rested a hand on his arm. "Look, I'm not telling you what to do. I know your job situation. I know missing a shift costs you more than most folks, but sometimes the world gives us a chance to do something that matters." Elijah didn't answer. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. There were realities he could not ignore. Missing work meant losing hours. Losing hours meant losing pay. Losing pay meant falling behind on rent. The math was harsh and honest. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. Miss Coleman nodded. That's all anyone can ask. But as Elijah walked down the hallway, a commotion near the emergency bay caught his attention. Nurses rushed past with equipment. A child's cry echoed, a raw, terrified sound no adult could ignore. Instinct overrode logic. Elijah stepped closer. Through the glass, he saw a tiny figure on a gurney, an unconscious girl with tangled hair and pale skin, wires attached to her chest, blood staining the sheets beneath her. And then, in a moment that felt almost unreal, her hand twitched and reached out, gripping the air-gripping hope. Elijah's breath caught. Something inside him shifted, steady and resolute. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know her story. He didn't need to. He whispered to himself, "If that were my child," but he stopped. Elijah didn't have children. He barely had anyone, yet the instinct remained, a deep, human responsibility to someone fragile and afraid. He walked straight to the nurse's station. "If I'm a match," he said, "take my blood." Miss Coleman exhaled with relief, jotting his name down. "You're doing the right thing, Elijah." He wasn't sure about that, but he knew it was the necessary thing. He followed the nurse to the donation room, unaware that the girl he was trying to save was Grace Hayes, the daughter of the very woman who moments ago had treated him like he didn't exist. Hours later, Caroline's scream would tear through the room. Hours later, she would realize the truth, that dignity did not belong to the wealthy, nor kindness to the privileged. But for now, Elijah climbed onto the donation bed quietly, offering what he had to give, expecting nothing in return. Only the steady hum of the hospital machines bore witness to the beginning of a change neither of them could foresee. The children's wing of St. Mary's always felt like stepping into another world, a small, stubborn pocket of warmth inside a city known for its sharp edges. Murals of cartoon animals lined the walls, faded from years of tiny hands touching them. Paper snowflakes hung crookedly from ceiling tiles, decorations left over from last winter because nobody had the heart to take them down. It was a place where time moved gently, where the sound of laughter from one room could soften the groan of an infusion pump in another. Elijah Brooks moved through the corridor with a familiarity that came from countless Saturdays spent here. If Hayes Global was a world where no one saw him, St. Mary's was a world where people noticed when he didn't show up. He greeted nurses by name, handed stickers to toddlers who held onto them like treasure, and paused to fix a loose wheel on a toy wagon that had been squeaking for weeks. His hands, calloused from years of work, held the wagon with a care that surprised anyone who didn't know him well. Miss Coleman watched him from the nurse's station, shaking her head the way someone does when they've spent half a life understanding people, and the other half wondering why the world didn't appreciate them more. "You always fix what's broken," she said as Elijah passed. "Toys, vending machines, hearts, whatever shows up." Elijah chuckled softly. "If only it paid better." "Oh, hush," she replied, but her smile carried something warm. "Some folks patch drywall. Some folks patch people. Not everyone chooses the harder job." Elijah picked up a fallen stuffed bear and set it on a child's pillow before moving toward the playroom. A little boy named Jamal looked up from a coloring book, waving. "Hi, Mr. Eli." "Hey, big man," Elijah said, kneeling beside him. "You make this masterpiece all by yourself?" Jamal nodded with the fierce pride of a 6-year-old with a box of crayons. Elijah ruffled his hair and returned to sorting Lego bricks into boxes, though he wasn't really organizing anything, just keeping his hands busy the way he did when thoughts pressed too hard. His mind drifted back to the morning at Hayes Global. He could still hear Caroline Hayes's voice, sharp, cold, dismissive. "Hey, you." Not his name, not even an acknowledgement of him as a person, just another piece of equipment in the hallway that needed to be moved out of her way. He'd learned long ago that some people lived above the clouds, never looking down unless someone inconvenienced them. But something about this morning had lingered longer than usual, sitting in his chest like a stone. "Earth to Elijah, Miss," Coleman said as she approached, breaking the quiet. "You're thinking too loud again." "Sorry," he murmured. "Long morning. You look like a man carrying too many thoughts in his pockets. Empty some of them out before you trip over yourself." She handed him a clipboard, the edges worn soft. "Here, this'll distract you. We've got a new group of volunteers next week, college kids. Think you can show them how to keep the peace around here?" Elijah smirked. "You sure I'm the man for that? I'm just the—" "Don't finish that sentence." Her tone sharpened with all the authority of someone who had raised 4 sons. "You're not just anything." Before he could answer, the overhead intercom crackled. "Trauma team to emergency. Trauma team to emergency. 8-year-old female, unstable vitals." Miss Coleman's expression shifted from light teasing to professional focus in a heartbeat. "That's the kid I told you about earlier." "Any updates?" Elijah asked. "Nothing good." She started down the hall, but paused and turned back to him. "If they can't find enough O-negative, things may get worse." Elijah stood in place long after she disappeared around the corner. He stared down at his hands. Strong hands, capable hands, hands that could lift, fix, mend, hands filled with blood the hospital needed. He shook the thought off, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. If he fainted after donating, he'd miss his evening shift. Missing a shift meant losing hours. Losing hours meant risking rent, and rent didn't care if you saved a stranger's life. Still, something gnawed at him, a quiet feeling he couldn't quite name. He tried to push it away, crouching to gather more toys scattered across the floor. But then came another announcement. "Massive transfusion protocol activated. All O-negative donors, please report to the lab." Elijah froze again. His heart beat once, twice, too loudly. Jamal tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Eli, why does the lady sound scared?" Elijah knelt beside him. "Sometimes people get hurt, buddy. The doctors are doing everything they can." "Will the kid be okay?" Elijah hesitated. "I hope so." The uncertainty sat heavy on his tongue. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the emergency bay. Ambulances came and went in frantic bursts. Nurses pushed carts stacked with equipment. Doctors huddled, faces tight with urgency. It should have been easy to walk away. He'd walked away from plenty opportunities that dried up, promotions he was passed over for, people who saw only the uniform and never the man. But walking away now felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. Miss Coleman reappeared beside him, her voice soft. You matching O negative is no small thing, Elijah. I know. And I know your situation. I know you can't afford to lose hours. He swallowed hard. Yeah. She touched his arm gently. But there are moments that decide who we are. Not who the world says we are. Not who our job says we are. Who we say we are. He stared through the glass again. A nurse sprinted by with a red cooler labeled blood product. Another pushed a gurney through swinging doors. The chaos pressed against him, urging him forward. He heard the faint sob of a woman somewhere down the hall. He didn't know it yet, but it was Grace's surgeon briefing Caroline for the first time. Elijah inhaled deeply. His lungs tightened. He set down the toy wagon he'd been holding. I'll go get tested, he said quietly. Miss Coleman nodded as though she'd expected nothing less. Good, come with me. They walked toward the lab, passing families holding hands, paramedics unloading stretchers, and volunteers carrying warm blankets. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the door to the donation room, Elijah paused. If I'm a match, he didn't finish. Miss Coleman did it for him. Then you'll save a child's life. Elijah nodded, his throat tight. Let's do it. He stepped inside without realizing the invisible threads tying that moment to everything that would follow. Behind him, the noise of the hospital surged on. Ahead of him, destiny waited quietly, patient and unassuming. He had no idea he was walking toward the child of the woman who had looked at him like he was nothing. No idea that his choice would undo her world and rebuild his own. All he knew was that a child needed help, and helping was something he still knew how to do. The fluorescent lights in the donor screening room hummed overhead, casting a pale wash across the stainless steel counters and the neat stacks of medical forms. Elijah sat on the edge of a vinyl chair, hands clasped loosely between his knees. His heart hadn't slowed since he left the children's wing. It beat with a stubborn insistence that something important was about to happen, even if he couldn't fully name what it was. A technician in blue scrubs, short and sprightly, pricked his finger and collected a small sample. She worked quickly, professionally, without judgment. Something Elijah appreciated more than she knew. We'll run this downstairs, she said. O-negative donors are rare. If you're a match, we'll need you pretty fast. Elijah nodded, though his stomach tightened. He could feel the weight of every hour he might miss, every dollar he couldn't afford to lose. The technician disappeared behind a swinging door. The silence that followed stretched long and taut, broken only by distant hallway chatter, doctors calling orders, the squeak of a gurney turning a corner, the muted crying of someone receiving bad news. Then Miss Coleman stepped into the room, reading his expression like an open book. You look like a man trying to convince himself of something, she said. Elijah attempted a smile. Trying to, yeah. She leaned her shoulder against the wall. These moments aren't easy, especially for folks who've had the world on their backs for too long. It's not that I don't want to help, he said, but my shift starts at 6. If I'm dizzy or out for the night, I lose hours. Losing hours means losing rent. Of course it does, she agreed softly. Life doesn't give you much cushion. I live paycheck to paycheck, Elijah murmured. If I lose this job. He didn't finish. Didn't have to. Miss Coleman folded her arms gently, the way a mother might when bracing herself to give advice that could hurt before it heals. You're not a selfish man, Elijah. You wouldn't be here if you were. But sometimes the good thing and the hard thing are the same thing. He rubbed the back of his neck. I know. I don't know if I can afford to be a good man today. She let the words settle. They didn't judge him. They simply existed raw and honest. After a long moment, she whispered, doing what's right has never been about affordability. But it's okay to be afraid. Elijah looked at the doorway the technician had vanished through. Doesn't feel okay. Fear means you care, she said. Folks who don't care never fear the consequences. Footsteps echoed in the hall. The technician reappeared, her expression brisk and purposeful. Mr. Brooks, you're a match, and the girl is declining fast. Elijah's breath left him in one sharp exhale. The room seemed to tilt. A match. That tiny fact, so technical, so biological, suddenly felt crushing. The technician continued. "We need you now." The transfusion could decide whether she stabilizes. His pulse thudded in his ears. He heard every sound, the ticking of a wall clock, the tap of a pen against a clipboard, the rush of blood under his skin. He wasn't thinking about the girl anymore. He was thinking about getting dizzy on the job. Missing hours. Missing rent. A dizzy janitor is a replaceable janitor. I don't think I can," he muttered, the refusal heavy and reluctant. The technician didn't respond. She'd heard refusals before. She simply nodded and stepped aside, leaving him room to reconsider or walk away. But Miss Coleman remained. She didn't beg, didn't guilt him. She simply sat in the chair across from him and said quietly, "Every life has a few crossroads. This is one for you." Elijah stared at the floor, at the speckled tile beneath his boots. "I can't lose my job." "I know," she said, "but you'll lose something else if you walk out of here." "What's that?" "The part of yourself that still believes in helping people." The words landed with surprising force. Because she was right, helping was something he understood, something that felt like the last remaining piece of who he used to be before the layoffs, before life carved him down to the bone. He opened his mouth to respond, but a commotion in the hallway cut him off. A stretcher rolled by quickly, nurses gripping rails, an oxygen mask pressed to a young girl's face. Elijah caught only a glimpse: pale skin, tangled hair, limp arms. Her body jerked slightly as a nurse adjusted the IV line, and then her hand twitched, reaching, searching, grasping at the air for someone who wasn't there. That moment tore something open inside him. The technician turned back. "We need an answer, Mr. Brooks." For a split second, Elijah felt suspended between two worlds, the world that demanded sacrifice for strangers, and the world that punished him for every lost hour. He looked again toward the hallway where the stretcher had vanished. His voice broke as he spoke. "If I'm a match, take my blood." Miss Coleman exhaled as though she had been holding her breath for minutes. The technician nodded sharply and motioned him onto the donation bed. Elijah sat down, rolling up his sleeve. His hands trembled, not from fear of the needle, but from the weight of his decision. "We'll monitor your vitals closely," a nurse said, fastening a blood pressure cuff to his arm. "You'll be okay. Just stay relaxed." Elijah laughed quietly. "Relaxed isn't really my thing today." The nurse inserted the needle gently, a thin tube filled with dark red blood. His blood, carrying oxygen, hope, and something he didn't yet recognize. Destiny, maybe. "Thank you," she murmured. It felt strange to be thanked for something that scared him so deeply. As the bag slowly filled, Elijah drifted in and out of thought. He pictured the girl's small hand reaching into the air. He pictured the exhaustion in Miss Coleman's eyes. Then he pictured the morning's humiliation in the lobby, the CEO's cold voice, the sting of her judgment. Oddly, that memory didn't matter now, not compared to the quiet urgency humming through the room. He whispered to himself, "Let this help her, whoever she is." He didn't know her name, didn't know her mother, didn't know he was altering the course of two lives, one small and fragile, the other powerful and blind to her own flaws. Outside the room, nurses hurried past with updates. The world continued rushing around him. But inside, everything narrowed to one simple truth. He had given what only he could give. And somewhere down the hall, a little girl's fate was shifting because Elijah Brooks had chosen the harder path, the right path. A path he didn't yet know was leading him straight toward the greatest reckoning of his life. The hallway outside the blood donation room thrummed with the tense rhythm of a hospital in crisis, rushing feet, clipped orders, rolling metal carts bumping over uneven tiles. But inside the small, sterile room where Elijah lay connected to the IV line, everything felt strangely suspended, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The donation bag was nearly full. Elijah's eyelids fluttered, not from fear, but from the slow drain of energy that came with giving more than his body comfortably could. His chest rose in steady, measured breaths. His fingers twitched once against the blanket draped across his lap. He was tired, very tired, but he remained calm, anchored in the decision he had made. Across the room, a nurse adjusted the flow rate, checking the line, then glanced toward the doorway where Caroline Hayes stood frozen. She had gone silent after her initial outburst, the fierce declaration still hanging in the air. "Why are you taking his blood? I do not allow this." The absurdity of it, of believing she could control even the biology of who could save her child, echoed in her ears. Her face, once flushed with anger, now drained of color as her gaze clung to the man on the bed. Elijah, the janitor she had humiliated that morning. Her throat tightened, and her pulse hammered against her ribs, an uncomfortable, unfamiliar rhythm. The doctor approached her, calm, professional, steady. "Miss Hayes," he said, "we didn't have time to discuss this earlier. Your daughter arrived in hemorrhagic shock. Elijah Brooks is the only O-negative donor who was available in time. If not for him, she wouldn't have survived the first intervention." The words landed like stones dropped into deep water, rippling through everything she believed about control. Power had always been her armor status, her shield. But none of it mattered here. None of it could save Grace. The doctor continued. "He volunteered immediately, even before we confirmed the match." Caroline's breath caught. Before he knew who she was. "He didn't ask," the doctor replied. "He simply said he wanted to help." That simple truth tore through her defenses. She turned her eyes back to Elijah, seeing him in a way she never had before. Gone was the uniform she associated with anonymity. Gone was the distance she kept from people like him. All she saw now was a man who had stepped forward when her world collapsed, a man who had no reason to help her, and every reason not to. Her mind reeled back to the executive lobby. She relived the moment with brutal clarity. Her voice sharp, dismissive, the sting of superiority she didn't even try to hide. The way Elijah had lowered his eyes, as though he had learned long ago that arguing with people like her only made things worse. The humiliation radiated through her now, not as something inflicted, but as something she had delivered. And here he was, saving her child. A nurse approached Elijah's bedside, giving him a gentle nudge. "How you holding up?" He opened his eyes halfway. "Still here," he whispered, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Just tired." Caroline flinched, his voice quiet, patient-held, no trace of resentment. If anything, it carried a grace she didn't deserve, a kind of moral dignity she had spent years overlooking in others. "He's stable," the nurse told the doctor. "Vitals are good. We're almost done." Elijah gave a small nod, though his face had gone a shade paler. Caroline stepped closer, her heels silent now on the polished floor. For once in her life, she didn't know how to speak, didn't know what tone to use, what language to draw on. Apologies weren't part of her vocabulary, gratitude even less so. But she felt something else rising in her chest, a sensation she hadn't allowed herself in years. Humility. She swallowed hard. "Elijah." His eyes opened, but he didn't look at her with anger or accusation, only quiet acknowledgement. "Miss Hayes." She hesitated. The silence stretched thin between them, nearly breaking under the weight of all the unspoken truths. "My daughter," she began, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, forced steadiness into it. "Grace, she wouldn't be alive without you." Elijah blinked slowly, his expression unreadable. "I hope she pulls through," he murmured. "She's fighting hard." Caroline felt something crumble inside her. She had prepared for business negotiations worth millions. She had prepared for hostile takeovers, for press scrutiny, for committee hearings, but nothing prepared her for standing in front of the man she had wronged while he saved the person she loved most in the world. She forced herself to meet his eyes, something she hadn't done that morning. I spoke harshly to you today," she whispered. "I was wrong." Elijah said nothing for a moment. The beep of the monitor filled the room in the pause between them. "It was a long morning for everyone," he said finally. He wasn't excusing her, But he wasn't condemning her either. The neutrality cut deeper than blame ever could. The nurse checked the donation bag. "We're finished." She loosened the needle carefully, applying pressure to Elijah's arm. He winced slightly. Caroline's breath hitched, as though the small pain inflicted on him registered somewhere deep inside her. "We'll monitor you for a few minutes," the nurse said. "Just rest." Elijah nodded, leaning back against the pillow with a weary exhale. Caroline stepped back, giving herself room to breathe. Her legs felt unsteady. Her throat felt thick. She wasn't used to feeling insignificant, but in this room, in this moment, she was smaller than she had ever been. "Miss," Coleman entered, scanning the room until her eyes found Elijah. "Good work, sweetheart," she said softly, patting his hand. Then she turned to Caroline, her expression shifting into something harder. "You owe this man more than you'll ever understand." Caroline lowered her eyes, unable to respond. For the first time in her life, she felt the full weight of being judged and found lacking by people who had the moral authority she pretended to possess. A nurse rushed in breathlessly. "We have news from the OR. Grace is stabilizing. The transfusion worked." The room exhaled as one. Elijah's eyes drifted shut, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Caroline's knees buckled as relief flooded her. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She covered her mouth, shaking. Grace was alive, because of him. She turned back to Elijah, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Elijah." He didn't open his eyes, but he heard her, and that was enough. As Caroline stood there, surrounded by nurses who had witnessed the collapse of her pride, she felt the shift begin quiet but irreversible. The kind of shift that marks the line between who a person was and who they might become. Elijah lay resting, unaware of the transformation unfolding around him, but the truth was clear. The balance of dignity between them had changed forever, and nothing, not power, not wealth, not corporate walls, would ever return it to the way it was. The quiet hum of the hospital seemed to fade as Caroline stepped out of the donor room, her heartbeat pounding louder than the squeak of gurney wheels and the distant beeping of monitors. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and panic, both sharp enough to sting. Moments ago, she had stood a few feet from the man she had ridiculed, watching him give blood for her child with a calmness she did not deserve. That truth still pulsed through her like electric current, but she had no time to linger in the heaviness of it. Her phone vibrated violently in her coat pocket. She fumbled it out, seeing a flood of missed calls and messages. Urgent. Return to office. Where are you? Investors waiting. Board not pleased. Need immediate appearance. The last one made her stomach twist. Hayes, you better get control of this situation. Bad optics. Optics. Her daughter was fighting for her life, and they were worried about optics. She pressed the phone to her ear. "This is Caroline." Finally, the voice of Richard Bowen, chairman of the board, grated through the speaker. "Where exactly are you?" "At the hospital," she replied curtly. "My daughter had emergency surgery." Richard sighed, annoyed. "Yes, we heard something about that, but you missed the investors' briefing. We're on the verge of closing a $3 billion expansion contract, and your absence is not helping." "My child is in critical condition," she repeated, slower, harder. "Surely you understand that." "Understand." "Of course," Richard said. "But emotions cannot derail corporate obligations. This company has responsibilities. Investors don't care about personal tragedies." The words struck her cold. Once, she might have said the same thing. Once, she would have rolled her eyes at excuses, even tragic ones. But now, standing in a hospital hallway that smelled of fear and hope and human fragility, the old version of herself felt like a stranger. "I won't apologize for choosing my daughter," she said. "We need you here regardless," Richard pushed. 5 minutes. Zoom call. Non-negotiable. Caroline pinched her eyes shut. The hospital ceiling came into blurry, focus-white tiles, harsh lights, a small crack above her where water had damaged the paint. It looked fragile. Everything did. "Fine," she whispered. 5 minutes. She hung up and exhaled shakily, as though each breath had to force its way past a barricade. A nurse walked by, giving her a sympathetic glance. Caroline wondered if the nurse had heard the conversation. Of course she had. Everything in hospitals was overheard: grief, anger, whispered secrets, the rawest parts of life. She turned and walked toward the family waiting lounge, each step heavier than the last. On a wall-mounted TV, muted news segments played footage of an unrelated corporate merger. Words flashed at the bottom of the screen: markets shift on CEO uncertainty. Her face had been in similar segments before, celebrated for her ruthlessness, her efficiency, her flawless execution. But now the sight made her chest ache. She took a seat in the corner, opened her laptop, and joined the Zoom call. Richard appeared immediately, flanked by two board members, stern, irritated, impeccably tailored. "Caroline," Richard started, voice clipped, "we'll be brief. The investors are questioning your leadership stability. We need reassurance you're fully committed." She blinked. "Fully committed? My daughter nearly died today." Yes, and we sympathize," Richard said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But your personal life cannot interrupt our timeline." She stared at him, stunned by the coldness. Once, she had considered these men equals. Now she saw them clearly, individuals who had traded humanity for quarterly gains. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked, incredulous. "Abandon the hospital while my child is in recovery?" Immediately, a different board member, Ellen Drake, spoke up. "No, but we expect you to prioritize. You have staff who can handle family matters. The company needs your focus." Staff. As though her daughter's life was a task to outsource, Caroline's jaw tightened. "I'm not discussing this further." Richard leaned forward. "The expansion deal is at risk. If we lose it, the board will have to question your position." "Are you threatening my job while my daughter fights to live?" she whispered. Richard didn't flinch. "We're reminding you of your obligations." There it was, the truth beneath the corporate gloss. Power mattered more than people. She had lived by those rules for years, enforcing them, climbing over anyone who faltered. But now, those same rules felt grotesque. "This conversation is over," she said sharply. "I'm staying with my daughter." She closed the laptop without waiting for a reply. Her reflection lingered in the black screen, her face pale, her eyes tired, and something else too, a flicker of awakening, a shift, a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. She set the laptop aside and rubbed her temples. Her mind drifted back to Elijah, the man who gave blood without hesitation, who acted with more integrity in 1 hour than she had in years. She could still hear his tired voice. "I hope she pulls through. That's what matters. That's what matters." A phrase so simple it felt like a verdict, a truth, a warning, a mirror. She stood and walked toward the ICU hallway, passing the nurse's station where Miss Coleman was reviewing charts. The older woman looked up. Their eyes met, Caroline's full of lingering shame, Miss Coleman's steady with a kind of quiet authority Caroline wasn't accustomed to receiving. How's he doing?" Caroline asked, voice soft. "Resting," Miss Coleman replied. "He gave more than he should have, but he insisted." "He shouldn't have had to," Caroline murmured. "Yet he did," Miss Coleman said gently. "Some people choose kindness even when the world hasn't been kind to them." The words pressed into Caroline's chest like a bruise. She looked down the hall toward Elijah's room. "I need to thank him properly." "You will," Miss Coleman replied. "But right now, your little girl needs you." Caroline nodded slowly. Her heels clicked softly as she approached Grace's room. She paused at the doorway, placing one hand on the glass. Grace lay in the hospital bed, small and fragile under a tangle of medical lines, her chest rising in shallow breaths. Machines beeped steadily beside her, each sound a reminder that she was still here, still fighting. Caroline's throat tightened again. She whispered through the glass, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." Behind her, the hospital lights flickered, and the echo of the board's demands faded beneath something stronger, a realization that the life she had built, the power she had worshipped, had hollowed her out. Elijah's sacrifice had exposed it. Grace's fragility had magnified it. And now, for the first time in a very long time, Caroline felt the weight of choosing what truly mattered. She stayed by her daughter's door long after the hallway quieted, silently vowing that the world she returned to, the corporate world demanding her coldness, would not be the same woman who left it. She didn't know how she would change. She only knew that she would, and the first cracks in her armor had been carved by a man she had once thought invisible. Evening settled over St. Mary's Hospital like a heavy blanket, dimming the windows, softening the hallway chatter, and casting everything in a muted amber glow. Nurses changed shifts, machines beeped steadily. The world outside moved on, unaware of the invisible battles unfolding in small rooms where love, fear, and survival clung to the air like mist. Inside the donor recovery room, Elijah lay propped against a thin pillow, his arm wrapped in a bandage, a faint tremor still moving through his fingers. A cup of orange juice sat untouched at his bedside. His breath had steadied, but the exhaustion beneath his skin remained, woven into his muscles and bones. He was better, but not well. There was a difference, and he felt it in every breath. Miss Coleman stood beside him, arms folded, watching him with that firm but kind gaze she reserved for men who thought they were invincible. "Drink," she instructed, nudging the cup toward him. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah murmured, taking a sip. "Not ma'am," she corrected. "Coleman. Or, if you insist on being polite, Nurse Coleman." Elijah managed a tired smile. Hard habit to break. "So is working yourself into the ground," she shot back. "And you're right on schedule." Elijah sighed, letting his head sink deeper into the pillow. "How's the girl?" "Stable," she answered, "holding on. Your blood bought her time." Elijah nodded, relief softening the lines around his eyes. "Good." Miss Coleman studied him a moment longer. "You know this won't be the last time you worry today." "I know," he admitted, "but I'll deal with it." "Will you? Because I heard your phone buzzing earlier. Loud enough for the whole hallway." Elijah grimaced. "My supervisor. What does he want?" "To remind me I'm scheduled tonight," he said, "and that last-minute absences won't be tolerated." Coleman muttered something under her breath that did not sound charitable. "He knows you're donating blood?" "I didn't say it," Elijah replied. "Didn't want to sound like I was making excuses," Coleman huffed. "Saving a child's life is not an excuse. It's a contribution to society, more than some people ever make." Elijah chuckled weakly. "He won't see it that way." "Then he lacks imagination," she snapped. "Or a heart." Elijah rubbed his forehead. "I can't afford to lose hours this week." "I know," she said gently, "but you can't afford to lose consciousness while mopping a floor either." Before he could respond, a soft knock sounded at the doorway. Caroline stepped inside. Not the Caroline Hayes who commanded boardrooms. Not the immaculate woman whose presence filled entire hallways. This Caroline looked smaller somehow, eyes red, hair disheveled from hours of pacing, her expensive coat hanging askew over her shoulders. "Miss," Coleman turned to her, expression cooling. "Visiting hours for donors aren't exactly strict," she said, "but don't tire him out." Caroline nodded, eyes never leaving Elijah. "Thank you. I won't stay long." Coleman slipped out quietly, though not without shooting Caroline a pointed look that said she was being watched. The room grew still. Elijah shifted slightly, adjusting to face her. "Miss Hayes," he said, voice soft. Caroline took a slow step closer. "How are you feeling?" "Better than earlier," he answered. "Just worn out. They said that's normal." She nodded. "They said you gave more than the standard donation. They needed it," he said simply. "If it helped your daughter, it was worth it." Caroline's throat tightened. She swallowed hard. "It did help her. More than you know." She paused, gathering her breath. "I owe you my daughter's life." Elijah looked away, uneasy with the weight of gratitude. "I know you don't owe me anything." "But I do," she insisted. "And I don't know how to express that properly." "A thank you works," he offered gently. She exhaled shakily. "Thank you, Elijah." Her voice trembled. It startled her. She was not a woman who trembled. He nodded. "You're welcome." An uncomfortable silence followed, thick with things unsaid. Elijah broke it. "She's going to be okay?" "They think so," Caroline whispered. "She's stable now. The surgeon said your donation bought them time to stop the internal bleeding. Without it," her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking fast. Elijah didn't respond with words. Instead, he let the weight of what she wasn't able to say settle gently between them. After a moment, Caroline lowered her hand. "There's something else I need to say." He waited. "I was cruel this morning." Elijah stayed quiet. "I was unkind," she continued, "and thoughtless, and I spoke to you like you weren't human. Her voice broke again. "I'm ashamed of how I treated you." Elijah considered her carefully, not judging, not rushed, just listening. "It was a long day," he said again, the same line he'd offered earlier, but this time it carried a different weight, a quiet understanding, not an excuse. Caroline shook her head. "Please, don't make it easier for me. I don't deserve that." He held her gaze. "Maybe not, but forgiving you makes it easier for both of us." She blinked, stunned by the softness in his tone. Men with power rarely forgave quickly. Men without power rarely forgave at all. Yet here he was offering her grace she could not buy. Caroline cleared her throat. The board called earlier. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, they weren't happy you weren't at work." "That's an understatement," she muttered. "They threatened my position if I didn't return." Elijah winced. "I'm sorry." "No," she said. "I'm sorry. I created a world where people feel afraid to put humanity first, and now I'm trapped in it myself." Elijah studied her for a long moment. "You're not trapped," he said quietly. "You're choosing." She sank into the chair beside his bed, feeling the truth of the words settle heavily. "I used to think power meant never bending," she whispered, "but today I learned it's the opposite." Elijah didn't reply. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. A nurse peeked in to check Elijah's chart, smiling at the sight of him awake. Caroline stood. "I should let you rest." Elijah nodded. A gentle acknowledgement. "Take care of your daughter," he said. "That's what matters." The echo of his earlier words returned simple, honest, undeniable. Caroline stepped into the doorway, pausing before leaving. "Elijah," she said softly, "when all this passes, I hope we can talk again. Properly." He nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. But the shift had already happened, in Elijah's calm endurance, in Caroline's awakening, in the invisible thread now connecting two lives that had collided through pain, pride, and sacrifice. Outside, the hospital lights hummed softly as night deepened, and the quiet war inside both of them continued changing who they were, shaping who they might become. Morning broke over Chicago with a gray, reluctant light, the kind that seemed to apologize for arriving. Inside St. Mary's Hospital, however, time did not move with the sun. It moved with the rhythm of machines, the murmurs of nurses, the cautious footsteps of families praying for miracles. Caroline Hayes had barely slept. She had spent most of the night in a stiff chair beside Grace's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her daughter's chest, listening to the monitors beep their steady reassurance. Grace looked impossibly small under the tangle of tubes and blankets. Every now and then, a tremor in her fingers or the twitch of an eyelid made Caroline lean forward, whispering softly, "Mommy's here, sweetheart. I'm right here." By dawn, her spine ached, her eyes burned, and her mind spun with thoughts she had spent years avoiding, thoughts about values, about people, about the world she had built her life around. She rose slowly, stretching her stiff arms, when her phone vibrated again. She didn't need to look to know what awaited her. Messages from board members, reminders of obligations, veiled threats disguised as corporate language. Finally, she checked. The board chairman. We need your presence this morning. No exceptions. The CFO. Silence is hurting stock confidence. Legal counsel. Press is noticing your absence. Prepare a statement. Investors. Stability questioned. Attend call immediately. Every message was cold, sterile, transactional. None asked about Grace. Not one. Caroline's jaw tightened. The woman who had once built an entire career around satisfying this exact group now felt a dull disgust rising inside her. She silenced the phone and stepped out into the hallway. She found Miss Coleman near the nurse's station. How was she through the night? Caroline asked. Stable, the older nurse said, smiling gently. Her vitals are steady. She's fighting. Caroline let out a long breath. Thank God. She hesitated, then asked quietly, And Elijah? Resting, Coleman said. Still exhausted, but his vitals are fine. He'll need the day. Caroline nodded, relief stirring in a place she hadn't expected. I'm glad. Coleman raised an eyebrow, a knowing look softening her sternness. He did a big thing yesterday. Changed the whole course of events. Yes, Caroline whispered. He did. And you? Coleman asked gently. How are you holding up? Caroline exhaled. Not sure who I am today. Coleman patted her arm. Good. Means you're growing. Caroline wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry at that. Instead, she thanked the nurse and walked toward the small hospital coffee stand near the lobby. She needed a moment, just one moment, to gather herself before facing the world that was demanding she forget everything except business. But as she waited for her coffee, she overheard a conversation behind her. Two nurses. Did you hear? The donor Elijah gave, almost to his limit. He shouldn't have, but he insisted, like saving that little girl was all that mattered. Meanwhile, her mother storms in yelling about whose blood it was. The nerve. Caroline closed her eyes. Her grip tightened around the cardboard cup. She wanted to turn around, defend herself, but she couldn't, because they were right. She had acted horribly, and the truth was, she hadn't earned the forgiveness she wanted. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She walked toward a quiet hallway to clear her thoughts before returning to Grace, but her phone rang again. Richard Bowen, she answered. What? We're starting the investor call in 7 minutes, he barked. We need you on camera. You cannot miss this. My daughter is recovering from emergency surgery, she said coldly, and the donor who saved her is still being monitored. None of that concerns us, Richard snapped. The company is at stake. My child's life is at stake, she corrected sharply. There is no comparison. Caroline, he warned, voice dropping into the tone he used right before board votes. If you don't appear this morning, the board will have to reconsider your role. I'm not threatening you. I'm stating fact. She went still. For years, she had cultivated a persona of precision and control, building power like a fortress brick by brick. Losing her position would erase decades of work. It would destroy her reputation, her influence, her identity. But then she looked through the window into Grace's room, saw the small rise and fall of her daughter's chest, saw the faint flush of life returning to her cheeks. And suddenly, the threat felt insignificant. Do what you need to do, she said, her voice sharp as cut glass. Richard stuttered. Excuse me? You heard me, she said. If my job is contingent on abandoning my daughter, then fire me. I won't leave her. Caroline, this is unacceptable. Goodbye, Richard. She hung up. Her hand shook. But it wasn't fear this time. It was clarity. A clarity she had never felt in boardrooms or executive meetings. A clarity born from watching a man with no power use the little he had to save a life. She turned and walked down the hallway, her heels clicking with purpose, not corporate purpose, but human purpose. She didn't go back to Grace's room immediately. Instead, she went somewhere else. To Elijah. When she stepped into his recovery room, he stirred, blinking awake. You shouldn't be walking around, he said softly, concern pulling at his tired voice. You should be with your daughter. I will be, she said. But first, I need to do something I should have done long ago. She pulled a chair to his bedside and sat. I told the board I'm staying here, she said quietly. They threatened my job. Elijah frowned. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause. You didn't cause anything, she said firmly. What they did was wrong, and I've been wrong too. For years. Elijah watched her, cautious, curious. What changed? She drew a breath. You did. He blinked. Me? You gave what you didn't have to give, she whispered. You showed courage without expecting credit. You did something that reminded me what leadership is supposed to look like. He shook his head slightly. Leadership? She nodded. Yes. Leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility, compassion, humanity. Somewhere along the line, I forgot that, but I'm remembering now. Elijah stared at her, unsure what to say. She continued. When Grace wakes up, I want her to live in a world where her mother stands for something better than profit margins. And I want the people who work for me, people like you, to know they matter. She paused, letting her next words settle between them. I'm going to make changes at Hayes Global. Elijah arched a brow. What kind of changes? The kind that should have existed all along, she said. A community support initiative. Programs to help workers facing emergencies, medical or otherwise. Fair treatment. Real dignity. She leaned forward. And I want your help. You've lived the reality we ignored. Elijah blinked, stunned. Me? Yes, she said. You. For the first time since she had entered the room, a faint smile broke across Elijah's tired face. You're serious? More than ever, she said softly. The room fell quiet again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was full of possibility, of change, of something beginning rather than breaking. Elijah finally nodded. If it helps others like me, I'll help. Caroline exhaled, relief washing through her. Thank you. She stood slowly. Your rest isn't over. I should go back to Grace. Caroline? Elijah called gently. She paused. Yes, your daughter's lucky, he said. Not because of what I did, but because you stayed. She swallowed hard. I didn't always stay, she whispered. But I will now. She left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. In the hallway, the morning light had grown stronger, streaking gold across the polished floor. It felt symbolic, like the dawn of something new, something rebuilt from broken pieces. In that moment, Caroline Hayes knew the truth. The turning point had come. Not in the boardroom, not in the hospital, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet room where a janitor lay recovering and a CEO rediscovered her humanity. And nothing in her world, nothing would be the same again. The sun had risen fully now, painting thin streaks of pale gold across the windows of St. Mary's Hospital. But the warmth outside never touched Elijah Brooks, not as he sat on the edge of the patient bed, finally cleared to stand, nor as he rubbed the stiffness out of his eyes. The exhaustion from donating blood lingered like a weight across his shoulders, but that wasn't what troubled him most. It was the message glowing on his phone screen. Again. You missed your shift last night. This is unacceptable. Call me as soon as possible. And another. Final notice. We need reliability. Elijah stared at the texts for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. Every word felt like a bruise. He had saved a life. But the world he lived in, the paycheck-to-paycheck world, did not care about heroics. It cared about attendance. Hours logged, floors mopped, trash emptied, no exceptions. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, taking a slow breath. The hospital room hummed with soft sounds, rolling carts, distant murmurs of nurses, a lullaby playing faintly in the pediatric wing. But inside him, a storm churned. You okay, miss? Coleman's voice arrived gently from the doorway. Elijah straightened slightly. Yeah, just tired. She stepped inside, folding her arms with the authority of a woman who didn't tolerate lies. You're not just tired. What's going on? Elijah hesitated, then turned the phone so she could see the screen. Her eyes narrowed. "They're punishing you for saving a child's life." "They don't see it that way," Elijah murmured. "To them, I'm a shift, a pair of hands, a body doing a job. If that body doesn't show up, someone else has to fill in, and that's all they care about." "That's nonsense," she snapped. "And unfair. Fair isn't part of the equation where I work." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "You know how it is. When you don't have leverage, you don't have rights." "Not really. You have dignity," she corrected firmly. "And that's more powerful than leverage." Elijah chuckled dryly. "Dignity doesn't pay rent." "Maybe not," she admitted, "but it keeps the world from swallowing you whole." He looked at her, tired but grateful. "I'll figure something out. I always do." But inside, he wasn't sure. Not this time. Not when a single missed shift could mean losing the only job he had left. Before Miss Coleman could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway. A familiar voice followed. "Elijah?" He turned. Caroline Hayes stood in the doorway, her expression gentler than he had ever seen it. There was no corporate armor today, no cold efficiency, just a mother whose world had tilted sharply off its axis. "May I come in?" she asked. Elijah nodded. Miss Coleman gave them space, slipping quietly into the hall. Caroline stepped inside, closing the door halfway behind her. "I came to check on you," she said. "And to thank you again." Elijah offered a faint smile. "Grace doing okay?" "Better," she whispered. "A lot better. They say she has a strong chance now." Relief passed across his face. "That's good. I'm glad." Caroline hesitated, then glanced at the phone still in his hand. "Is everything all right?" Elijah's instinct was to dismiss it, wave it off, spare her the weight of his problems, but something about the way she looked at him made the old reflex hesitate. He sighed. "My supervisor isn't happy I missed my shift. But you were here," she said, "saving a life. Doesn't matter." "Not to them." "That's absurd." He shrugged. "It's the reality for people like me." Her brow tightened, something fierce and protective rising unexpectedly inside her. "What will happen? Could lose hours. Maybe the job. Because you saved a child?" He didn't answer. The silence said everything. Caroline felt shame twist inside her, not just for how she had treated him before, but for how the world treated people like him every day. People who didn't get grace, people who didn't get second chances, people who didn't get to make mistakes or emergencies or sacrifices without paying for them later. People like Elijah. "This is wrong," she murmured. "Deeply wrong." Elijah shrugged gently. "It's life." There was no self-pity in his tone, just an acceptance forged from years of walking the harder road. But Caroline wasn't willing to accept it. Not now. Not after everything he had done. Suddenly the hospital intercom buzzed overhead, announcing visiting hours and reminders about hygiene protocols. It jolted her from her thoughts. She straightened. "Elijah, who is your supervisor?" He lifted a brow. Mr. Rourke." "Why?" "I want to talk to him." Elijah shook his head immediately. "No. Please don't. It'll make things worse. They don't like trouble. And if they think I'm bringing trouble—" "You didn't bring trouble," she said firmly. "You saved my daughter. But they won't care." "Then they'll care about what I have to say," she countered. "Miss Hayes," he said gently, "you don't have to fight my battles." She swallowed. "Maybe not. But maybe I should have fought them long ago." Before he could respond, a soft knock interrupted. A young nurse stepped inside. "Miss Hayes, your daughter is waking up." The world tilted. Caroline's hand flew to her mouth. "She's waking up?" "Yes," the nurse beamed. "Slowly, but she's responding." Caroline turned to Elijah, eyes shining. "She's waking up," he smiled. A real smile, faint but warm. "Go to her." "I will." She hesitated at the door. "Elijah, we're not done talking. I promise you that." He nodded. "I know." When she disappeared down the hall, Miss Coleman re-entered quietly, watching Elijah's expression. "You look like a man who just ran 5 miles in his mind." "Feels like it," Elijah admitted. She sat beside him, her daughter waking up. "That's something to hold on to." "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." But as rewarding as that was, the shadow of his job still loomed, heavy and cold. "What if I lose the one thing keeping me afloat?" he whispered. "Then something better will come," Coleman replied. "Life doesn't stay closed forever." Elijah didn't argue. He didn't have the strength. But part of him wondered, what if it did? Later that morning, after another round of vitals and juice cups and reminders to rest, Elijah finally stood and gathered himself to leave. The hospital had cleared him, though they urged him to move slowly and take breaks. He stepped into the hallway just in time to see Caroline through the window of Grace's room. She was holding her daughter's tiny hand, head bowed, shoulders shaking with silent tears. Relief, gratitude, love. He stood there a moment, watching mother and child bathed in the soft morning light. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, unaware that outside these hospital doors lay a collision of consequences, some waiting to crush him, and others waiting to rewrite everything he thought he knew about justice, loyalty, and who he was allowed to become. The hallway outside Grace's room felt warmer now, alive with something gentler than panic hope. Soft sunlight filtered through the blinds, spreading faint stripes across the floor as nurses walked by with quieter steps, smiling more often, whispering updates that carried relief rather than dread. Grace was awake, still weak, still tethered to machines, but awake. Caroline had spent hours at her daughter's bedside, stroking her hair, whispering stories from her childhood, apologizing for being gone so much. Grace had listened in the half-conscious way children do, offering tiny nods, a faint squeeze of her mother's fingers. Those little gestures had unraveled Caroline completely. For the first time in years, she had cried without shame. But now that Grace slept again, peaceful and safe, the weight of another truth pressed heavily into Caroline's chest. Elijah, the man who had made this moment possible, the man whose kindness defied everything she believed about power, hierarchy, and the walls people built around themselves. She had seen the messages from his supervisor. She had seen the fear in his eyes, fear not of losing status or reputation, but losing the paycheck that kept the roof over his head. The injustice of it churned in her, hot and unfamiliar. How many times had she allowed this system to punish people like him? How many times had she benefited from it without a second thought? Too many. Far too many. And she would not allow it to happen again, not to him, not after he saved her daughter. She rose from her seat, smoothing the wrinkles from her blouse out of habit more than vanity, and stepped quietly out of the room. The pediatric wing smelled faintly of lavender from a diffuser a nurse had plugged in near the station, a small act of comfort for families too familiar with loss. Caroline inhaled deeply, grounding herself, then began walking. She stopped outside Elijah's recovery room only to find it empty. The bed was neatly made, the monitor turned off, the machines quiet. For a frightening moment she thought he'd left the hospital entirely. She nearly turned to find a nurse when she spotted him down the hallway, moving slowly, deliberately, as though each step was measured to keep exhaustion from overtaking him. He wore his same gray uniform, though someone had removed the IV bandage from his arm and placed a clean cotton pad beneath a strip of tape. He looked tired, too tired, and alone. She approached. "Elijah." He turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Hayes, you're leaving?" He nodded. "Hospital cleared me. I've taken enough of their space." "You donated blood until you nearly passed out," she replied. "You could rest another day." "Rest doesn't pay bills," he said with a faint smile. "I need to get home, then figure out my next move." She hesitated. "About your job," Elijah sighed, glancing away. "It's okay. I'll talk to my supervisor. Explain what happened. Hope they understand. And if they don't, then I'll deal with that when it comes." He shrugged with a quiet resignation that cut her deeper than any accusation could have. Caroline stepped closer. "You shouldn't have to deal with consequences for saving a child." But that's the world I live in, he replied softly. Emergency or not, missed hours are missed hours. She felt her chest tighten. The world I live in. His words played in her mind like an indictment. Elijah, she said gently, I can speak to your employer. No. His refusal was immediate, firm but not unkind. Please don't. If they think I'm using connections, or worse, that I dragged you into something, they'll let me go faster. She opened her mouth, then closed it. He wasn't wrong. People like his supervisor thrived on authority extracted from those beneath them. Then at least let me help in another way, she insisted. You've helped enough, he replied. More than enough. No, Elijah, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You helped me, in a way I can never repay. He met her eyes, then steady, warm, far more patient than she deserved. You don't owe me anything, he said. I did what any decent person would do. That's not true, she whispered. You did something extraordinary, he shook his head. I did what I hope someone would do for my child if I had one, that's all. There was such sincerity in his tone, such uncomplicated goodness, that Caroline felt the sting of tears again. She blinked them away quickly. Will you at least let me drive you home? She asked. You shouldn't be walking or taking public transit in your condition. I'll manage, he said. I've been through worse. She frowned. It's not about what you can survive. It's about what you deserve. A moment passed between them, quiet, laden with unspoken emotions neither fully understood yet. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said. A ride would help. Thank you. Relief washed through her. Good. Wait here. I just need to check on Grace one more time, then I'll take you. He nodded and leaned gently against the wall, conserving energy. Caroline stepped away, but only a few paces down the hall. She paused and turned. He stood quietly, looking down at his hands. Hands that had worked hard their entire lives. Hands that had held tools, pushed brooms, carried burdens no one saw. Hands that had saved her daughter. She returned to Grace's door, peeking inside. Her little girl was still sleeping, but in the peaceful way children do when the worst danger has passed. A nurse adjusted the blanket, then gave Caroline a small nod. She's stable. You can step out for a bit. We'll watch her. Caroline lingered just long enough to whisper, Mommy will be right back. Then she walked back down the hall to Elijah, who stood straighter when he saw her. Ready? She asked. Ready, he said softly. They walked through the hospital side by side, an unlikely pair connected by a thread of fate neither of them could have imagined. As they stepped into the crisp Chicago air, a breeze curled gently around them. The world felt different, larger, more fragile, more hopeful. Elijah squinted at the morning light. Caroline paused, keys in hand, studying him. Elijah, she said finally, after everything you've done, I can't let the world take advantage of you anymore. He raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She took a breath, the decision solidifying in her chest. I'm going to make sure justice finds you, the quiet kind, the kind you deserve. He blinked, surprised. Caroline. But she stopped him gently. Let me do this, she whispered. Not out of guilt, not out of pity, but because it's right. Elijah looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, slowly accepting, cautiously hopeful, though unsure what the future held. Neither of them knew it yet. But this moment, this quiet exchange in the hospital parking lot, was the beginning of the reckoning to come. A reckoning that would challenge the structures above them, the assumptions within them, and the balance of justice between them. Everything was about to shift, and for the first time, they were shifting together. The drive to Elijah's apartment was quiet. Not an uncomfortable silence, but one weighted with thoughts neither of them dared to voice. Chicago's morning air held a crisp chill, brushing across Elijah's cheeks as he leaned against the passenger window. He watched the city blur past brick buildings, corner stores rolling up their shutters, parents tugging along sleepy children. Ordinary life, life he might lose if his job slipped away. Caroline occasionally glanced at him, noting the fatigue still etched into the lines around his eyes. She hated that he'd walked out of the hospital looking like a man carrying 3 decades of burdens, while she walked out looking like a woman who finally understood what burdens really were. When she pulled up in front of his modest apartment building, aged brick, chipped steps, a crooked mailbox, Elijah murmured, "This is me. Thanks for the ride." But Caroline didn't unlock the doors yet. "Elijah," she said quietly. He turned to her, waiting. "I meant what I said earlier. I'm going to help you. Truly help you." He gave a tired smile, the kind worn by men who have been disappointed by promises too many times to trust easily. "I appreciate that. But you've got your own battles, and yours matter too," she insisted. "They matter to me." His expression softened with surprise, but before she could say more, several teenagers passing by shouted his name, waving at him. "Yo, Mr. Brooks, you back? You good, Mr. B? We heard someone said you fainted. That true?" Elijah sighed, embarrassed but amused. "Go to school," he called out. "Don't worry about me." Caroline watched him, how the kids lit up when he spoke to them, how he lifted their spirits even when he had none of his own. Something about that hit her deeper than she expected. He mattered, in ways the world didn't measure, in ways she had never bothered to look at before. He turned back to her. "Thanks again, Caroline, for everything. I'll check in later," she said, "and please rest." He nodded, stepped out, and closed the door gently behind him. She waited until he disappeared inside the building, then pulled away from the curb with a knot forming in her stomach, because now she had a battle to fight, and she was done being silent. By the time she reached Hayes Global's towering glass headquarters, her jaw was set, her shoulders squared. The automatic doors parted, releasing the familiar blend of citrus cleaner and corporate ambition. Employees glanced at her with surprise, some with relief, others with fear. Word traveled fast. Everyone already knew the board had been furious. Everyone knew something was coming. But no one expected it would come with Caroline moving like a woman who had nothing left to prove to them and everything to protect. She called a meeting. Not a request, a command, her voice echoing through the executive floor. "Full board, conference room A, 10 minutes. The room filled quickly. Richard Bowen first, looking irate. Ellen Drake next, lips pursed with disapproval. Then the other members, shifting in their leather chairs like spectators at an arena waiting for bloodshed. Caroline entered last. She closed the door with a quiet click that resonated more than a slam. Richard didn't bother hiding his disdain. "Caroline, this impulsive power play isn't." "Sit," she said sharply. He froze. Everyone else froze. She remained standing. "Before we begin, let's clear one thing. The next person who questions my priorities as a mother will be removed from this board." Several members exchanged stunned glances. Richard huffed. "This isn't about motherhood. This is about leadership." "Then let's discuss leadership," she said, stepping forward. "Specifically, what it means when we're so disconnected from humanity that we punish compassion." She told them everything, not in the tearful voice of a mother, but in the controlled, razor-edged cadence of a CEO who had finally seen the truth and refused to unsee it. She spoke of Elijah's donation, his sacrifice, his job being threatened, his life hanging in a balance created by systems she herself helped build. "This company," she said, eyes sweeping across the table, "cannot call itself a leader in American enterprise while operating with moral blindness." One board member shifted nervously. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A new initiative," she replied. "A comprehensive community support program for non-salaried workers, both within the company and in our extended network." Another scoffed. "Community support? Caroline, we are not a charity." "No," she said sharply. "But we are also not a machine that chews up working-class people who keep our buildings running." "This will cost millions," Richard snapped. "Profit margins." "Profit margins didn't save my daughter," she interrupted. The room went silent, completely silent. She continued, voice steady but trembling on the edge of conviction. A janitor did. A man treated as disposable by the world. A man I myself treated poorly. A confession. Powerful. Humbling. Human. The board member shifted, uncomfortable with her honesty. Richard crossed his arms. So, what? You want to overhaul our structure because you feel guilty? No, she said. I want to overhaul it because it's right. If you push this, he warned, you will lose board support. Then so be it. The words dropped like stones into a pond ripple, spreading instantly. Richard's face reddened. You're willing to sacrifice everything, your entire career, for a janitor? No, she replied, her voice softening. For justice. Silence again. But this time, it felt different, charged, shifting. Caroline pressed on. If this board believes my job is at risk because I chose my daughter's life over a meeting, then let the record show. I will walk out before I ever bow to that. Ellen leaned forward, voice surprisingly calm. Caroline, what changed? Caroline inhaled. I finally realized that power means nothing if it isn't used to lift others. The room sat with that. Heavy, transformative. After a long pause, Ellen spoke again, slowly. Then, I support the initiative. Richard snapped toward her. Ellen, I support it, she repeated, firmer. One by one, others followed. Uncertain at first. Then more confidently, until only Richard remained. He glared at Caroline with quiet, simmering hatred. You'll regret this. Possibly, she said, but not as much as I would regret staying silent. He slammed his notebook shut. Fine, but I will not be part of this naive downfall. Then step down, she replied calmly. And he did. He stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him, a door she had closed gently when she came in. When it settled, Ellen exhaled. Caroline, what you're doing is brave. She shook her head. It's overdue. As the meeting adjourned, Caroline stepped into the hallway feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Lightness, purpose, integrity. She checked her watch. It was time to return to the hospital. She walked toward the elevator, but paused by a window overlooking the city. The skyline stretched outward, glittering in the sunlight. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment, Elijah was recovering quietly, preparing to face a world that never offered him protection. But now he wasn't alone, she whispered softly, almost to herself. This time, justice will find you, and with that, she headed back to the one place she needed to be, with her daughter, and with the truth finally steering her forward instead of pride. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Street Mary's like ribbons of soft gold, warming the pale floors and casting gentle halos around the nurses bustling from room to room. Caroline walked quickly down the hallway, her heels tapping a calm, confident rhythm different from the frantic pacing of yesterday, different from the cold, authoritative strides she used to command her corporate world. Today, her steps carried purpose, anchored not in power, but in truth. She paused outside Grace's room and peered in, her daughter small, but fierce in the way only children battling pain can be, sat propped against pillows, a coloring book open on her lap. A nurse smiled beside her, pointing at a half-finished unicorn. Grace's eyes lifted as if sensing her mother. "Mommy," she whispered, voice raspy but hopeful. Caroline's breath hitched. She stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a hand across Grace's forehead. "Hey, sweetheart, did you get the mean men to stop calling you?" Grace murmured. Caroline blinked. She didn't know Grace had overheard anything the night before. "They're not calling anymore," she said softly. "Mommy took care of it." Grace nodded, satisfied. "Good." Then, almost dreamily, she whispered, "Did the nice man get better?" Caroline froze. "What nice man?" "The one who gave me the special blood," Grace said. "I heard the nurses talking." Caroline swallowed. "His name is Elijah." "Elijah," Grace echoed. "Is he okay?" "He's resting," Caroline replied, her voice soft. "He's very tired, but he's okay." Grace smiled faintly, then touched her chest as if feeling the weight of her now beating heart. "I want to thank him." The simplicity of those words pressed tears into Caroline's eyes again. She leaned forward and kissed her daughter's forehead. "You will, sweetheart." Soon, after Grace drifted into another gentle sleep, Caroline stepped back into the hallway, only to find a familiar figure waiting at the far end. Ellen Drake, board member, realist, a woman who had never wasted breath on unnecessary words. She approached with measured steps, hands clasped. "Caroline," she greeted. "The board meeting is over. We've approved the community initiative in writing." Caroline nodded. "Thank you. I didn't come to say that," Ellen replied. "I came to say I'm proud of you. This company needed a leader with a spine and a heart. We finally have both." Caroline exhaled through her nose, humbled, caught off guard by praise she didn't think she deserved. "It took me too long to understand things that should have been obvious." "Understanding usually comes late," Ellen replied. "But it came." After a brief pause, Ellen added, "And for what it's worth," Richard tendered his resignation. Effective immediately. Caroline inhaled sharply. "Good. It's a new era," Ellen said, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder before walking away. "Make it count." Caroline stood there absorbing the strange, quiet feeling swelling inside her. For years, she had associated leadership with intimidation and dominance, but what she felt now was different, solid, grounded, deeply human, and for the first time, it felt real. When she left the hospital later that evening, she didn't drive home. Instead, she drove to the small apartment building where she had dropped Elijah off earlier. Something told her the conversation between them, the real conversation, wasn't finished yet. She climbed the narrow stairwell to the second floor, listening to distant footsteps, a baby crying somewhere, a TV muffled through thin walls. She knocked. A moment passed. Then the door opened. Elijah stood there, leaning slightly on the frame, wearing a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, looking more rested but still tired. His eyes widened a little. "Caroline, can we talk?" she asked quietly. He stepped aside, letting her in. His apartment was small but clean, neat, with modest furniture and the scent of something warm. Cinnamon? Coffee? It felt lived in, honest. She didn't sit. "Elijah," she began. "I came to tell you something important." He waited, patient. "The board threatened me today," she said, "because I wasn't there during Grace's surgery." Elijah frowned. "That's insane." "Yes," she replied. "It is, and I told them so. Then I told them if they forced me to choose between my daughter and my job, they could fire me." Elijah blinked. A pause. "You said that?" "I did. And you still have your job?" "I have something better," Caroline said softly. "I have control of my conscience again." She continued, "I pushed through the new initiative. For workers like you, benefits, emergency support, job protection in medical crises, wage stability, and I want you to be part of shaping it." Elijah looked stunned. "Me?" "Yes," she said gently, "because who else understands what's broken better than someone who's lived inside it?" Elijah's throat tightened. "I don't know anything about programs or corporate stuff." "You know dignity," she said. "You know resilience. You know injustice when you see it. That's more than most executives ever learn." He sat down slowly, trying to absorb it all. "Caroline, why me?" "Because you changed me," she whispered. "Because you saved Grace. Because you saved me." His eyes lifted to hers. She wasn't crying, but emotion trembled visibly in her gaze. "When I saw you give blood," she continued, "when I realized what you were willing to risk for a child you didn't know, something inside me broke open. Something I didn't know needed breaking." Elijah looked away, overwhelmed. "I'm just a janitor, Caroline." "No," she said firmly, stepping closer. "You are not just anything. You are a man of integrity, of courage, and the world needs more of you." He met her eyes again. For a moment, the room felt impossibly still. Then she added quietly, Grace wants to meet you, to thank you. Elijah's breath caught. I would like that very much. She smiled, a small, sincere smile that softened her entire face. Good. They stood there, both silent, both changed by the past 48 hours in ways neither could have predicted. Finally, Elijah asked, "Caroline, what happens now?" She considered that. "Now?" she echoed. "Now we rebuild. Together." A spark flickered behind Elijah's eyes, hope mixed with disbelief. "Together," he repeated softly. She stepped back toward the door, giving him space. "Get some rest. Grace will want to see you when she wakes again," he nodded. "I will." When she reached the doorway, he added, "Caroline?" She turned. "Yes? Thank you. For fighting for me. For seeing me." The words hit her harder than any bored confrontation. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for reminding me what humanity looks like." She left his apartment with a feeling spreading through her chest, not victory, not triumph, but an honest warmth she hadn't felt in years. As she stepped into the evening air, the city lights blinking awake one by one, she knew with absolute certainty that her life had shifted permanently. Grace was alive. Elijah was no longer invisible. Justice, at last, was beginning to breathe. And somewhere between all of that, Caroline Hayes finally understood what kind of woman she wanted to be. One her daughter could be proud of. One Elijah had unknowingly inspired. One who believed that quiet acts of courage could rewrite the laws of power itself. The night wrapped around her gently as she walked toward her car. A new chapter had begun. One of healing, one of reckoning, one of unexpected connection between a CEO, a janitor, and the little girl whose life had tied them forever together. And like all stories born from truth, this one was only just beginning.